Kintsugi listeners and fans of our conversations, of which we're getting increasing numbers, right? Which is very exciting. So, share, like, or pass on if you enjoy this podcast. But welcome, and as always, this is the bit, Danny, where I always say the same thing, basically, but it's always true. I am very excited and enjoying a huge privilege to talk to somebody I'm inspired by often, right? Particularly from recently hearing a beautiful story about, basically about your purpose, right? And the personal journey that led to some of the important activities that you're engaged in now. So it's Danni Petrosevic, is that it?
Danni Petkovic, hi.
Danni, thank you so much for joining Kintsugi and for being open to a conversation about something that is, you and I both know, should be a very comfortable and important conversation that everybody has often, but isn't, out there. It's not something people talk about. So Danni, you are the manager or event coordinator, director of Dying to Know Day, which is a day that marks the need to talk about death and dying on a community level. And
yes.
And that is an incredible position that you've taken on. And you are a death doula, right? Somebody who cares for families and individuals going through the end-of-life process. What a fascinating and incredibly important roles you have taken on. Tell us a bit about how you ended up in that space.
Yes, thanks, John. It's really it's interesting hearing you repeat it back, because I feel so privileged and honoured to be doing this work, and it's no accident. I deliberately changed careers last year, and it was after study, reflection, and deep, deep grief. And for me, becoming an end-of-life or death doula, and I also like to use the word mortality doula, because it doesn't have to be working with people who are dying. It can be working with people who are well, that want to get their end-of-life wishes in order to not leave a mess for their family. And what that means is that sometimes I have to support them to lean into their own mortality. And I was very death phobic before my most recent bereavement, which was the death of my brother, who was 10 months younger than me. And in July, it'll be 3 years since he died. And his sudden illness with a brain tumour and death quite quickly 6 months later was very confronting. The difference for me in my life until then, and I had about 12 different career paths at that point, was that we had support in his death from end-of-life carers, support people, doulas, but really planners to ask the questions, and the right questions, of what his death was going to look like, what it meant for him and he was a single dad to 3 teenage children, and what that meant for the future of them and his legacy. And for me, it was very confronting, questions like, where do you want to die? What do you want to happen to your body after you die? They were confronting, but what they did was they facilitated conversations that I wouldn't have been able to, and no one in my family would have been able to. And it opened the doors to this possibility that we can talk about it and make it okay. And it gave his life meaning, and it gave his life legacy, legs, like I was able to know what he wanted to do once he wasn't here to do it. And it was the 7th death that I'd been present for in my family. Even though I was very death phobic and had a lot of death anxiety and anxiety over my own mortality, I was that person in my family from a really young age. Like from 19 that was the one that gathered everyone to create a eulogy to help facilitate the funeral plans, that was holding the hand on the deathbed. But the only time in these 7 deaths that death and dying were used as those words and the questions were deliberately asked was in my brother Shane's death. And it really changed everything for me. And in the deep grief, I just kept coming back to this, you know, in meditating and dreaming of, I can do this work, and, you know, I want to support people because it's life-changing, and it's our only certainty in this human form that we're going to die, that everybody dies, that there's an end to life. And it's kind of one of those things that's still swept under the rug or considered taboo, and it's not taboo. It's actually affirming and reassuring, and it actually helps lift a weight when you've talked about it, when you know what your family want. If something were to happen tomorrow, death's not just old people. It happens every day, and it happens at any age. So, yeah, that's where I'm at. So managing the campaign is such a privilege. You know, I really feel honoured to have taken those reins for some incredible, you know, change makers and thought leaders in the space that have gone before me, to really shape death literacy in a different, or shade it in a different light here. And then, you know, the other work is supporting people and their families with their end-of-life journey,
Amazing. There's so many questions I have, right? So I'll try not to interfere with your wonderful sharing. But the first one is, like, we talk about the need for these conversations around death and dying, right? To be more explicit, to be more candid, to be more pointed, right? To be more relevant and practical. Why? What happens when we have these kind of deeper, more open conversations?
Beautiful question. We confront something that's there. It's always there. It's hanging over us. And for a lot of us, we don't confront it until we're forced to. So there's the first challenge, is that we're busy going about our lives, things are great, and then we either get a diagnosis, or a loved one does, or someone has a sudden death. You know, God forbid it's your child, or it's your, you know, somebody that is out of the natural order. It's not expected. And, you know, there's only a perception of this natural order. That's not actually a thing. It's just what we've made of it. So we're going about our business and we've not thought about it. We've not lent into it. And so therefore it's shocking. And then, you know, grief is very complex depending on what you've already been through. But what it does is it stops us in our tracks. It forces us to think about everything. And then when we haven't actually done that before, it floods us with way too many thoughts and feelings and emotions. Whereas if we actually know that there's a drawer over there that's got my, you know, end-of-life book or my end-of-life box, and it contains my advanced care plan. So it tells, you know, the authorities, and, you know, it's uploaded to my records. My doctor knows, my partner knows, my kids know, my parents know, whatever, that I don't want to be resuscitated, or, you know, I'm okay with these sort of things, but I'm not okay with these other things. I want to be buried. I do not want to be cremated. You know, I want to be as natural as possible. I want to have, like, you know, a funeral, a fun party for a funeral. I don't want the morbid church, you know, celebration that ends with stale sandwiches. I don't know. Like, that's just an example. But I think the challenge is that when we're not talking about it as a part of life, like we go and get a license, we go and pay our taxes, we sign up to all the things that we have to because we're told to. But this one we're not told to. So if we don't do it, then it's more confronting and challenging when we are forced to because of adversity or sadness or grief and bereavement.
Yeah.
So if we're planned when life's going well, the other thing is, if you have assets, if you have a child, if you have anything that's more complex, and most of us have something that, you know, we're leaving behind, we leave a mess. And if it is that you don't know whether your mum, dad, brother, sister, child wants to be resuscitated, if you've got a few of you in the room and there's no one decision maker that's been appointed, there's an argument because you've got different beliefs, you have different values, you have different life experiences, and that's messy and ugly, and you're already faced with sadness and grief. So making it as simple as possible for people so they follow your plan. You know, we plan months for a birth or a wedding. Why don't we plan for death? You know, and it's one of those things that is not joyful. Death is sad. Dying is sad and can be very messy and ugly. And, you know, the last 100 and something years we've outsourced it, so it isn't everyday conversation for us. It's not where we lay the body in the front parlour of the house and everybody gathers and breaks bread and tells stories and grieves together. It's very isolated, and it's become taboo, even though it is absolutely not taboo, and it's become, you know, foreign for us. And I think that's where the difficulty is. And I think that if we lean into it and just, you know, get your affairs in order, as one of a better expression, then you get on with living and you don't have to think about it again. You know, every year or two, you might want to update a financial will or the legal component, but there's emotional things. Who gets your pet? Who gets your phone full of photos and, you know, your passwords to your computer and your book collection and those little things that are not, you know, your family recipe that you may have hung on to that's been handed down to you. There's things that sit outside a legal and financial will that have meaning to us, that help create a legacy. Then my kid can tell her kids, you know, if I never get to know them, that, you know, this was my favourite meal, or this was my favourite thing to do, and this is what I was good at and what I loved and what I shared, you know. It's meaning making. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's huge. Well, you know, so and I was interested because you talked about being death phobic, and you know, you also talked about other traditions and cultures which deal with death differently than, say, our Western culture.
Yes.
You know, the one, you know, that Australia signs up to, right? And I'm interested. Is it about our own fear of death that often means we are unwilling to confront the needs and conversations with others? Is that something connected?
For me, it definitely was. My first job was as a police officer, and even though I saw much of the wrong side of death and was confronted with death a lot, my own mortality was still a block for me. So I could never go there thinking, one day this ends. One day I'm not going to be here anymore. One day there's nothing. And then what? And one day and one day. And not having a religious upbringing per se, where it was, you know, this is what you should believe. It was, you know, open for me to make decisions about. And not having anything, I really lent into lots of different philosophies and studies and really tried to unpack that and never really quite got there. Last year I was invited to contribute to the Death Letter Project, which the fabulous Dr. Tina Fiveash, who's a photographer and artist and social worker, created. And it's asking people what is death to them and what happens after you die. She has a particular interest in near-death experiences, and so she talks to lots of different people. And when I was confronted with writing that letter, it really brought up my mortality and how much it's shifted over the years. So for me, that was definitely part of the problem. I think it is, if you haven't lent into your own mortality, how can you then have conversations that are meaningful with others about what your wishes are if you don't ever acknowledge you're going to die and that life ends? Yeah. I think it can be, you know, based on experiences. If you weren't allowed to go to a funeral as a child, if you saw death in a different way, or there was some sort of fear instilled in you about death and dying, I think there's so many reasons why we don't lean into it. And partially we're too busy, and there's so many other things to talk about and that we're forced to confront. Like I said before about, you know, basic things like, you know, paying your taxes and registering for voting and, you know, things that we're forced to do. we're not forced to do this, so it is a choice, but, you know, it's a choice that we often leave too late. Most Australians don't have advanced care planning and directives done. Like, the percentage is something like 28%. Less than half of Australians have a will. And, you know,
Wow,
far
that's
less than,
surprising.
it's shocking, and far less than those two things is that none of, you know, the percentages, like, not even in double digits of how many Australians have had meaningful end-of-life planning conversations with their family, or the people that will be left behind to make decisions or clean up the mess, or, you know, or make your life meaningful in the way that you wanted it to be, in that your legacy is this. And it's, you know, it's becoming more mainstream. There is a bit of press covering it these days, but even the word doula is really not known in Australia. In Eastern cultures, it's absolutely really regarded. Sometimes in birth in Australia, it's been really known, but in death, it hasn't been. And that's, you know, a shift. Whatever you want to call us, it's a support person or a planner that helps you make those decisions and record them and then let people know. As part of the role that I have with Dying to Know Day, we run education sessions and we go into workplaces to help support people to have meaningful conversations at work. So we educate and advocate for conversations. So if one of your colleagues ends up having a terminal diagnosis or a life-changing illness, or they lose a family member to an illness or disease, you know, somebody dies, most of us don't know how to have that conversation at work. We spend a lot of our life at work. We educate and empower workplaces to have that knowledge and to be a community that can support a colleague or your boss or your staff if that happens. And then we go into community as well. So for Seniors Festival, we ran 10 Things to Know Before You Go in Chatswood. And, you know, there was 50 people in the audience, and some of the comments were incredible. They were, I've never, ever had these conversations with anyone, but I absolutely categorically know what I want to happen. I've just never told anyone.
Yeah, wow.
If you die tomorrow, the people don't know, you know? So it's always life-changing for people that have never had the conversation to do it in a fun and an easy way that's not, it's serious, let's sit down and talk about paperwork, you know? It's fun. We can have a laugh.
Well, I hear, you know, when you say that, it's hard for us in the, you know, in the population to grasp, you know, like our impression of the work you do must be that it's very solemn and miserable all the time, right? Are you constantly sad? But is that the case? Right?
Not at all. Not at all. Death is sad. The end of life is sad. But that's one moment in time. And yes, there's bereavement and grief that sits with you, and there's a mourning period. And, you know, for me, 6 months after my brother died was the worst part of my mourning. I was beside myself. I didn't know how I was going to continue. I didn't know how I was going to mum, how I was going to work, how I was going to exercise, be a partner, any of those things, because it was so he died in July, so it was like the Christmas period that was just yuck. But instead of pretending it wasn't there or numbing myself or busying myself, I lent into it. I did grief meditation. I did grief yoga. I did grief walks. I did grief webinars. I got a grief counsellor. I went to a grief circle. I really thought I really need to understand and unpack what these feelings and emotions are and why it's so different this time. I cared for my grandfather 15 years before, and when he died, I honestly thought, my daughter was 2, and I thought, I can't survive, and I don't know how I can be anything to her because the grief was so overwhelming. So I knew from that one that time doesn't get rid of the grief, but what it does is it allows life to continue around you and grow around the grief. The sadness is, I could be bawling my eyes out about the loss of my grandpa right now if I went to certain thoughts and memories. in those
Yeah.
16 years now, what's changed is that my life grew around that sadness and that grief and that loss. And I think that we find ways to continue, but it doesn't always make the meaning. So those other six didn't do the meaning that losing Shane did. Like, his death shifted something in me. And so at that 6-month mark, I went, okay, I'm going to do everything I can to unpack this and to try and feel all the feelings. And it landed me in this, hey, I've got this skill. I went and started volunteering at Cottage, which is a children's hospice in Manly, and, offering them the fact that I can sit with grief and death and loss, and I'm okay to have those conversations. How can I help you make legacy with your child that, is cruel and heartbreaking, but there is still a way to make meaning.
One of the great challenges of processing grief from my perspective is the humans try to make meaning of everything, right? We sort of measure the world, and it's crazy making to try and make meaning of somebody's presence, time allocated. Like it's they're here and then they're gone, and that is like indecipherable for us, right? Like, why is it? How is it? Justice doesn't work, fairness doesn't work. There's no kind of, you can't bargain away your time, right, or keep hold of it, right?
It's so true. It's so true. And I think that we have this conversation where I'm fighting cancer, I'm battling cancer. Well, you're not, because that kind of alludes to an equal playing field. It's not. It's awful. And the reality is that the meaning we make of something is made up. So, I decided that my brother's death had made me confront my own. And, we're 10 months young, in age. He's 10 months younger than me. So he's the closest person other than my parents that I've known my whole life. And I couldn't not confront my own mortality. And by confronting it, I realised that meeting it head on, instead of making a story about stuff, it allowed me to go, hey, what if it just ends and there's nothing, and I'm going to get on with making this life that I have now the most meaningful I can, and give as much as I can to everybody I can give to, and bring it in a way that is light and fun as well as serious and sad, because life is about all of the bits in between and not just the birth and the death.
We were given the capacity to have all of these emotions for a purpose. They're useful in some way in our survival. So, like, using them in an effective way to get through this must be a good idea. I just wanted to touch on, how you talked about, confronting your brother's experience and his passing brought on to you the need for you to come to some accommodation with your mortality. And from my perspective, I had a similar experience. The idea of, say, memento mori, right, from the Stoic philosophers, right, a moment of death is about sort of almost releasing us from the fear of death, right? When you understand that the moment of death is inevitable, I love the way you put it. You are then free to get on with, well, we need to make, our legacy while we're here. Is that like that freedom? Is that what this is about? Is it acceptance? Is that where we go? Is it sort of acceptance and then ownership of our own mortality?
That's an interesting way to phrase it, ownership. Yeah. It's definitely an acceptance thing for me. Like, I don't have to keep trying to work it out. I don't have to understand what happens next. I wasn't, I've seen enough death to kind of think there's something else. The reality is I did this course with a beautiful lady called Zenith Virago recently, and she runs Death Walkers, and it's about ceremony and end of life. And, you know, when sitting in her weekend of training and learning, it was really interesting because she's been doing this in the Northern Rivers region for about 30 years, and she runs a place called Natural Death Care Centre. And when she said, how many of you believe there's something else, like everyone's hands immediately shot up. And yes, we're in a room for death walkers, which is another word for doulas or support or planners. But what she said is, in all of her time, there's like a very small percentage of people that say no. So we all believe there's something. We don't know what it is. And the ones that profess to know what it is are as bad as the ones that say there's nothing, because, you know, you can't profess to know when you haven't been there. And that's what I made mention of in my death letter project. The reflection was, I don't know what there is after death, but I can't be witness to death and not think there's an energy that came from somewhere and that must go somewhere. So for me, that's enough. That's enough for me to go, okay, I've seen enough to say, okay, I don't need to work it out. I don't need to delve into that, because that's actually, for me, a waste of life now. What it is for me is every day living with a passion and living with a purpose that fills my cup and then allows me to fill others. And for me, that's everything. You know, I joined the police force to help people, and it took me 7 years to realise that was not the job to do that. But it's also taken me, what is that, 30-something years to then work out what that work is. And now the work is so meaningful that I don't question what's next. I just accept that I'm living each day like that. And so, you know, I might be here for another 50 years or it might be shorter, but either way, I don't have this thing hanging over my head that is pretending it's not going to happen. And I think that's it. If we pretend, it's fear-based, and the fear's now dissipated. It's completely gone. And I can't really answer what it is, but I know that talking about it and leaning into it and reading about it and studying it and, you know, having conversations and making legacy meaning, for me, has changed it, shifted completely. So I was at the point where, like, there's a thing called thanatophobia, which is intense death phobia. It's not just the normal, you know, worry. It's like intense, debilitating fear and anxiety about death. And that's where I was. I'd spent decades and decades trying to understand why I was so debilitated from my fear of death. And it was a stopping. Like, if I let it, it would control my life. It was controlling my life. It would, you know, stop me in my tracks. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I couldn't survive because of this weight and this fear, and it was driving everything.
So you have really embraced a form of, what, CBT, right? You're just immersed in it now. So
yeah. Wow. Overexposure? I don't know.
But it's incredibly, you know, interesting about, like, we talk often when we're talking about death, we naturally slip into the spiritual, but there's also really important elements of practical, which you touched on earlier. What are the things you need to do to help a family on that kind of operational sort of, you know, set up a good experience, both from a practical point of view, but also from setting them up to navigate that grief journey well?
Yeah, sure. I think meeting people where they're at. So not everyone's going to be okay with saying death and dying like we are. You know, so meeting them and using language that is what they're comfortable with, whether it's their diagnosis or someone else's, or it's frailty and aging, then just really being present, listening and hearing what they think they need in this scenario. And if that is, I don't know how to tell my kids, I don't want to inflict pain. My one job has been to protect them and look after them. I don't know how to tell them. So workshopping that, offering support and guidance to walk alongside them and be with them in the room if they need, on the phone, whatever it is that they need in that empowering them to know that they can do it. They can actually have these conversations, and that it's okay to accept help too. We spend a lot of time, particularly in our culture, of saying, "No, mate, we're right. I don't need help. I'm good. I'll help you, but I don't need it." And then when we actually need it, it's too hard. It's too hard to change that innate thing inside of us, or it's too hard to change everyone else going, "Oh, no, she never needs help. She's always got it under control." And so it's really just tapping into those things. So we'll start with, is it the paperwork? Do you have the necessary paperwork to make you feel comfortable about your end of life? And then, practical things like, where do you want to die? Is it at home? Is it at a hospital? Is it at a hospice? Because hospital's not designed for people to die in. It's to get people better and send them off. So we do have a capacity problem. We do have a big problem coming in the next couple of decades with, the baby boomer generation dying and us not having the population underpinning, that to support it and the facilities. So where do you want to die? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about who you want in the room? Have you thought about the things that are important? What scent? What music? What fabrics? Do you want your pets there? You've got a comment.
What's your last meal?
A big one. What's the last thing you want to eat? And in Australia, nearly every state and territory now has voluntary assisted dying as an option. So we're lucky that on the 28th of November 2023, that was passed in New South Wales here, and people can actually, if they fit the criteria, apply for voluntary assisted dying. And that plans it to within a minute of when they're going to die. And so, yes, I've heard some beautiful stories of people planning not just their last meal, but their last days and weeks, surrounded by family and nature and pets and, the things that are important to them in life. The expression is, we die how we live. So values are really important to us. If we value certain things in life, of course they're going to be playing a part in our death. And often they're not, because we haven't had the conversation. So then we get rushed to hospital and, there's machines trying to keep us alive when that's actually not what we wanted. So that does allow people to have some choice that wasn't there before. I did go to that appointment with my brother because he was eligible, and we did go to that appointment. But what I did notice and witness with him was that as soon as he was told that it's possible, he forgot about it. He just wanted to know that he had a choice. Yeah, right. And when you have most of your choices of every day taken away from you, you want control in any way you can. So I think it's all those meaningful things that mean something to you in life that we talk about what end of life can look like. And if it is that you really can't go there with people, then I can be that conduit to help. I can go between family members. Not every family is loving and peaceful, so that's tricky too. So how do you navigate that when someone's dying and you need to have conversations with people that you may have not had conversations with in decades? Just because your family doesn't mean that you're friendly. Yeah.
No, that's very true for so many. What when you think about the moment of death, like people, the period leading up to the people, do they, are they frightened? Are they? Do you think they ponder on what they didn't do? What do they? Is there time where they review some of the decisions and things they do, or is it something that they're looking out at?
Everyone's so different, and it depends on how much time they've had to plan and how well they are at. There's a big push about aging well now, so we support people to be as well as they can up until death, because dying has changed in Australia. It used to be 60 was old and then you just died, and now we have illness and medical systems that keep us alive longer, and so it's kind of bumpy at the end of life. So it depends on your condition of your quality of life and your condition at end of life. A lot of people will still say, I'm not ready to die, but I've accepted that this is a reality, so therefore I went down to Melbourne and saw a beautiful friend who was in his 70s, and he said, I thought I had another decade. I really did. But here's all the things that, we recorded something together. We talked about what he didn't want a funeral, and you don't have to have a funeral in Australia. So that's something that a lot of people don't know. We had a beautiful memorial party, and he had a beautiful collection he was a documentary filmmaker and beautiful journalist and writer, and he opened his book collection to all of his family and friends that came to memorial to choose something that meant something to them from him. And so even after his death, he had this beautiful message for us all. And so it's so different for everyone. I think that it's a spectrum of feelings and emotions. There's some people that are just like, I'm ready for what's next. I'm ready for the end of what this has been and the possibility. I'm ready for a rest and some bliss and some peace. Some people have really struggled and fought. My grandpa was 94 when he died, and he used to say to me all the time, even though we didn't use the words death and dying, he still said things like, I just want to sleep. I just want a big sleep. I just want to rest now. He came to Australia as a war refugee from Yugoslavia in 1949, and he really toiled. You know that word toil? He really toiled, and he had war nightmares in his, up until he died. He still had these horrid, prison camp nightmares. And for him, he was ready. His mind was still very sharp, but his body was failing and, shutting down. 94 years is a long time to be a human, particularly with the hard labour that he put in. He was a farmer and worked really hard. So he was very pragmatic. That comes across a lot. It is what it is. My brother used that a lot. I really hate it when I hear somebody say that in another context now, because it brings me back to being in his room. Yeah. And I'd say, what are you scared of? What are you feeling? What are you worried about? And he's like, don't cry. It is what it is. There's nothing we can do, and this is what it is. And it didn't make me cry less, but it sat with me that could be a contentment that someone gets to where they don't know. And I like to think that there's little messages from him here and there. And, other people I've supported have been very much, it is what it is. A beautiful man I supported recently used that line a few times with me. So I think
my mother tells me it is what it is every phone call. So
And do you feel like you can support her in her end of life wishes? And the reason I ask is because back when I was a death phobic, my grandma, I was supporting both. She had dementia, so I was supporting both of them to live on their farm, so my grandpa didn't have to go into care. And she would say to me every week, I want to be buried in the pink dress. I don't want to be buried in the white dress. I know I said that last week. And then she'd say, don't forget the socks. You know how I hate having cold feet. And I would just shut down. Grandma, don't speak like that. That's awful. I don't want to hear that. You're being morbid. And now I kick myself because I've changed so significantly that I wish I could have those conversations. And she was lucky. We're in a country town in Victoria, and she was able to have these beautiful conversations with the funeral director, who took her call every week and wrote down her new wish. But not everybody has that, especially in these big cities. So, like, can you have that? Can you be that person with your own lived experience for your mum?
I'm getting better. It's interesting, how many things come to mind when you share your experiences, right? Because I have lived experiences, as most people do, but in particular, some of the particularly tough things that you are talking about, like having the support of someone. So when my wife passed away, I had to share that news with the children, and I I was completely flummoxed about how I was going to do that, right? And it was it was a caring support person at the time who was able to give me something that I could sort of bite into, that at least allowed me to continue on and do something that is probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, right? Which is to stare at your children's eyes and tell them they're now without their mother. So that was the beginning of me understanding more about the what I needed to do, a journey I needed to take. And I can see parallels in what you're sharing. So without wanting to take over the story, I do have questions around that. Like I have that feeling of not knowing what to do, right, in that circumstance of death, right? And I wonder, is that, it was so important to me to have someone offer themselves and suggest and advise and be calm and responsive at that time. Is that what a death doula or a death walker, or however we characterize them, is that the number one role? I know there are practical things and there's conduits but that level of like you're walking this dark path with someone.
Absolutely. It's a support, it's a friend, it's walking alongside them on that path, and it's really like I said at the start, meeting them where they're at so you can actually be of help. Because if you come in with ideas, or you're not there to fix anything, death doesn't have a fix. You're not there to give advice. You're there to support. And if that is make phone calls, if that is take them to an appointment, if that is just listen to their stories, listen to their life, convey the message to other people when they're not able to. It's something that I really feel privileged to be able to support people with. And I think we don't want to inflict pain on anyone. So how can we help be that independent person that actually supports you to get that across, whether it's, just practicing it with you so you can do it, or actually being that person. The unique thing for me that I learnt before, look, it came to me that I'd been doulaing for many, many years and decades before I even knew what it was. So what I now see in reflection is that the thing that the doula has that the oncologist or the neurologist or the GP doesn't have is a continuity right through, or even the funeral director. So in an end-of-life experience where there's an illness, you're shunted between different services and they very rarely talk to each other. And so there's this constant having to repeat the story. There's a constant of people not knowing who you are. And a doula is often employed for that reason, because they're there from, if it's you just getting your plans in order now, then you come to me in, decades and decades later, say, oh, this has happened, here's what's happening for me. And, like for Shane's journey, the oncologist was brilliant. He was treating the tumour. The neurologist was Australia's best neurologist at Royal Melbourne, and she was treating the brain.
Yeah.
They didn't speak ever, The radiologist is looking after the treatment that he was having, but none of them spoke, and they all had differing opinions on whether he should, be keto, be vegetarian, eat whatever you like because you're going to die anyway, exercise, don't exercise, rest, sleep, it was all so different. So what I witnessed in him having this beautiful charity called Shannon's Bridge in country Victoria, who are end-of-life care people, they came all the way along the journey. And so when we were engaged, they were there every step of the way, and they actually knew who he was and treated the person. And with as a doula, we can help you with the funeral service, the celebration, the post-death care as well, and the rituals and the legacy and the stuff that is after death as well as in wellness and death. And that's something that's missing in our system in Australia.
Yeah, it's so true. How important is it after the initial ritual of funeral and wake, etc.? How important is that that people care in a special way, that acknowledging the journey, the grief journey and process from there, and what happens when it's done well?
I think I'm a bit of a living example of when it's done well, what you can actually then flow on to support other people and help other people and make a difference in other people's death and life, because you live up until you die. So, the quality of life is important for a lot of people. And I think that what I notice is that, sorry, can you ask the question again?
Yeah. Well, I was just wondering, so often all of that, peak of activity and ritual and so on, and then it just drops off.
Yeah.
And then people who are, grieving are almost left alone at that point. And I just wondered, how important is it for someone to, to help beyond that, the wake and the and the lasagnas that fill your fridge, and after that,
Yeah, my brain went firing in so many different ways. The studies done. There's fabulous people in the space. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was this amazing woman who came up with the stages of grief that has then been bastardized and used in the wrong way. But David Kessler is a guru in the space at the moment, and everything that I've learned is that grief needs to be witnessed. We want that person's name to be said over and over. If you think, I can't actually say their name because they'll think about it. We're already thinking about it. We're already deep in the perils of grief. And if you don't mention their name, you pretend they don't exist, then that's worse for grief. And that can create a whole complexity in grief that's, But for me, it was like leaning into all the things that shifted things, because I've been there before where it was like a deep, dark hole, where I was trying to be a mum to a 2-year-old. My grandpa, who's my favourite human on the planet, had died, and I felt the biggest hole in my world that was swallowing me, and I didn't know how to do anything except I had to get up every day and look after her. Now, I think that it's important that we talk about it. It's important that we have a culture in our society that, doesn't try to fix it, because there's no fix, that just talks about how are you today? If you don't know what you need today, here's how we can help. There's an app called HELP, Help. There's an app called Gather My Crew, and their help is specifically for end of life, but Gather My Crew is for other circumstances in life. But they're basically where you put out what you need and people sign up to different tasks. And it's a nice way to actually support us where we actually can't say yes to help because it's not natural for us, because, it's whatever it is, the reason that you can't actually say yes to help. So the Help app, the Healthy End of Life program, is a platform that has been designed for exactly that reason. And there's so many.
Sounds awesome. I haven't seen that before, but it would be wonderful to recommend it. I'm interested, when you said for whatever reason, do you think it's something like, we are so trained not to be willing or not to accept help or to see it as negative that we've lost the muscles for accepting help? We don't know how to do that.
We do, and we have. And, it could be not an end-of-life experience where we actually need community to rally together. There's a compassionate communities movement globally that is leaning to that. So last year, Compassionate Communities Australia was formed, and that's really creating a community where it may already be existing or it may not, but it leans itself to it. So, during COVID, we saw a lot of that. We got to know who our neighbours were. That's a community. My street might be my community. My group of friends might be my community. My kids, if you've got little kids, it might be the school community. there's all this different work. Work is such, I'm so passionate about getting people to have those conversations. I had somebody say to me, a question was asked about whether I was available on this day in a work sense. And I said, no, I have a grief circle then. And the comment, the really flippant comment that came quickly back, for what? And I said, well, my brother died. And the comment was, or question was, wasn't that 6 months ago? Oh my gosh, that was a knife to my heart. Like it really was, because that was when my grief was the worst. Everybody grieves differently. For me, the 6 month mark was awful. I talked to a friend who is at the moment at the National Centre for Grief, and she's doing study because she's a beautiful human who works at the Sydney Children's Hospital Foundation, coordinating their art programs. And she was sending me all these learnings that she's had that, are similar to the learnings I've had. And we're talking about how grief is so different for everybody. And one of the things she said to me this morning was we have symbols that raise a memory of the time you spent with them. And, she said we link objects and symbolically spending time with a loved one. And it got me thinking. And I said, well, how crazy is this? I've just moved house recently, and here's 2 items. And I took a photo of these 2 medications, supplements that my brother was taking that I couldn't throw out when I left house. So I've brought them from country Victoria to Sydney, and then I've moved house 2 weeks ago, and I had to make a conscious decision. What do I do with these? And I said to her, this is the weird thing grief does to you. I can't throw these 2 half-used bottles out. These were things that I was giving him every day to help with the effects of chemo and his pain and gut. And she said, because they're symbols. And so you spend time with him when you see those items. And, grief is so unique and different. The good morning. Do you know the good morning girls? They talk about every week. They're like, what did you do that was so griefy this week? And, that comes up for me, how griefy it is to hold on to these 2 out-of-date used bottles of supplements, So Grief Line is a beautiful for people too. That's an Australian option to get people free services as well. Sorry, you were going to say?
No, I was just going to say that amazing idea. See, one of the challenges, so full disclosure, I was diagnosed at one point with complicated grief, right? So, which I find kind of hilarious, right? Like I haven't seen any grief that isn't complicated in some way, right? But the idea that you're meant to run out of grief after a certain amount of time is just kind of a bit silly from the clinical side of things. But one of the challenges I found was as a man, right? When you are connected, when memories are your only contact to someone you love and aren't ready to say goodbye to yet, no one else will bring that up, right? So you actually don't have a chance to sit in those memories, even if they're sad or challenging, right? How on earth do you process them? And of course, there's that idea of you do want to remember much when you spend a life with people. It's not, you don't want to forget the things that were great or fun or meaningful. You want to be able to touch them without suffering, but people won't bring them up, right? Those conversations are avoided. And often it's done with care. They want to, save you grief, right? But in fact, grief is the way we process these, so it allows you to have memories.
Yeah, we're already in the pain of grief. We're already feeling it and sensing it and processing it every day. And I think I tell people that I need to talk about him and that I need to talk about it, so then it gives them permission to. I have photos and little mementos in different places that every time I walk past, it's a, hey, my bro. But I also know that some people, for that can actually, and it can actually make things much, much worse in the grief process. So they need to not have it. And in the early days, I actually I think I asked my partner and my grief counsellor, should I just move that photo that every morning and night I see because I am just inconsolable? And I couldn't bear to. And at different times it felt different for me. Some people absolutely need it. They need to be in a clean space to grieve and just be with the thoughts in their brain and their, but I'm very visual, and for me that was actually, it was a short time that I felt that, and then I got past it, and now I have a little smile and a talk. You know, I drive around with him in the car. I have a little memorial in my car as well, and so it's very different. And I think that, you know, my beautiful friend Rose, when she said that she's at the National Centre for Childhood Grief, you know, she said it's inspiring to hear about the process that allows people to talk about grief. And, you know, like it's really something that is different for everybody. But I think there's a commonality that we don't want people to hurt. We don't want sadness. And with grief and death, there's no fixing. And that's the hard part, because if we as humans want to fix things and we can't fix, it means being in the silence. It means allowing whatever is there to be without changing it. That's hard, but it can be really beautiful to just sit with it.
So much personal, learning in the process of walking through our own grief and learning about relationships, both gone and future, and so on. So it's, you know, it's not just about sadness, is it?
No. And, you know, like I have such fond memories. I have a laugh with people about silly things and fun things. And, you know, I have, like, it was my brother's daughter's birthday yesterday. She's 20, and we had 19. And we had, I'm aging her, and we had a moment of laughing. And, you know, like every now and then we'll share this photo that we know is a bit naughty because his beloved dog would climb on a table that the dog wasn't allowed, and we videoed it one time. And, you know, we just remember him being so like, you know, this is really forbidden to be on my grandma's table. And, you know, like we can remember things with joy and humour and love, so much love. You know, love, grief is just another expression of love, even though it's painful. It's just the way we relate to the person that we've lost with love that, you know, really shapes it.
I have a thought about grief being not necessarily like we are grieving not necessarily the person who's gone, right? They, you know, often they're in a situation that is actually improved, right? You know, like they're ready to go in some cases, or, you know, they're certainly beyond pain now, right? But we grieve the time we would have had them, our lives that are changed as a result of them not being in them. Would that be fair? You know, like the sense of I'm grieving that I have no more time, no more intimacy, no more moments to develop, no more Christmases, no more birthdays, whatever it is. Is that something we need to accept, right? That it's actually, you know, we're the grieving parties now. Right? It's about our life, and we can change that.
Yeah, I believe so. That's where the loss component comes in. You know, people say, oh, I lost my partner, and, well, you didn't actually lose them in that sense of they've gone missing. You know, it's the loss of our relationship. It's the loss of, it's waking up every morning and them not being there. It's birthdays, it's Christmases, it's celebrations where there's a real felt absence of that person and what they brought to the party in each scenario, in each setting. And I think you're absolutely right. It's the grief that we hold is the lack of their presence and those future, you know, I remember at my brother's funeral helping his kids be able to deliver a little speech about him. And, you know, we coached, my beautiful partner and I coached his eldest to how he was going to say the things that was so painful, but one of them was to say, I'll walk you down the aisle for Dad, for his little sister, because, you know, that's something that, you know, is in her future where he's missing. And so
Wow.
sometimes as a doula, that's something that, you know, like I spoke to somebody yesterday and it's like, can you record a message for their 21st? You're not going to be there. That's crap. But, you know, can we record something? So there's technology now where it can sit and deliver on their birthday a message. You know, that's pretty incredible. There are other ways, of course, but there are tech platforms that can do that for you. We live in a, you know, in this AI digital age like no other, but imagine getting that message. You know, is there stuff we can write down? Is there a little video I can make with you that is saying what your 10-year-old means to you right now, because you're not going to be there for 11, 12, you know, forevermore? Is there advice you'd like to give that you've learned in your life that, you know, for their wedding, for their job where they really hate it and they don't want to do this job anymore? Like, what's your advice when you're not going to be around to tell them? Like, can we make meaning of your loss in a way that is giving them something in the future that you're not going to be around to? So the grief, yes, it is about what we're lacking, but there are ways to kind of tie it back. Like, I never want to stop talking about the people that, you know, I have lost in my life, because that keeps them alive in my memory and makes me happy.
I had that brings up an important question. I have, you know, like I saw on television at one stage a bloke who people are engaging to turn up at their funeral, right, to deliver bad news, like saying, oh, you know, Uncle Bill, I don't like you, get out of my funeral, right, you know. And I don't know how good that is, but, you know, it's an interesting idea about, you know, with technology now we can reach into the future, which means, like, I always wanted to deliver a eulogy at my own funeral, which I can do now through technology, right? Amazing. But of course, I'm worried that people will go, just typical, wanting the, you know, the last word, of course, right? So, but I don't know exactly how well received it'll be. So.
Well, people are also opting to have living wakes and you know, like having those, doing their eulogy now while they're still alive with all the people around, hearing what people want to say about them. Why not? You know, there's so many times where those things are said posthumously that have probably never been said in life. Like, you know, like, why not? And you know what? Absolutely do it. No, you're not going to be around for them to chastise you, and you won't hear them say, you know, oh, he had to have the last word. Have the last word. Good on you. Bring some fun to it. You'll bring a smile to people's faces.
That's beautiful. Just on that words, Australians struggle to say things that are caring, you know, supportive or whatever. When someone at a funeral or whatever, it seems to be always a difficulty. What's the best thing to say to someone just in that moment when you're offering some form of support or condolence? Do you have something that works for you?
I like to ask what your favourite memories are, what you liked about them, what they were good at, and really just try and elicit things about, if I didn't know the person in life, then really elicit from the people that I'm supporting what it was that was the meaning in that relationship, and really trying to uncover who they are. And photos are very good at doing that. Like, we all have, you know, beautiful slideshows of photos at funerals now.
Yeah.
And I love that component, the music and the photos, because it tells a snapshot. It shows a snapshot. And I think that it is very hard to get those down, often because the grief is so intense. The loss is so fresh, and that's when you have to do it. But even something like, if they were here in the room now, what would you say to them? and, just trying to capture that, because
Yeah, right.
that puts you in a little bit of a different frame of mind if you're able to go there. That's really raw and honest and real. And then that can be translated into a story that people are going to relate to. People love stories. They do.
Yeah.
And they can, and, they find something about themselves in that story. They can relate on a human level, because that's our commonality. We're all emotive beings, and we're all going to die. And like pretending it's not going to happen is a bit crazy, actually.
Yeah.
Talking about death and pretending it's not going to happen doesn't make you immortal. So,
I have to say, people loving stories, and we're finishing on a note that says, what this story will be relevant to everybody who listens and everybody they know, right? It's a story we all have to shape at some point in our lives, right? So, I feel like today you've certainly created so much insight and so much momentum for people to start to explore that. Is there something you would recommend them do? You mentioned the McClissicks and the National Centre for Childhood Grief, and what would you recommend people do to further explore what we've encouraged them to think about today?
I would recommend August 8 is Dying to Know Day. I'd recommend looking in your local community if there is a Dying to Know Day event, because we are national. We have hundreds of events all around Australia, every state. That's a really easy way to go to something that is delivered in a way that is palatable for the masses. So that's one thing. There's a movement called the Death Cafe movement, where people go to a cafe or a building, and the commonality is cake, coffee or tea, and talking about death and dying. There's no agenda. It's just a nice way to come together as community. Joining a compassionate communities movement, if there's not one, creating one in your area. People want connection, more than ever in this digital age. People want human connection. I think looking at how, if there's not an event, are you prepared to create one? Are you prepared to jump onto Compassionate Communities Australia and find out who can support you to create a gathering? We held one in Terry Hills recently that was called Who's Got My Back, and it was a full day potluck, just bring a plate to share, and we just, no agenda really, and just had a beautiful day talking about what different experiences brought people there, and how talking about death and dying means different things to people, but they want to have that outlet. They want people to speak to. That all the research points to people want to talk about it, but they feel like they don't have anyone to talk about it. So creating those communities. And I think just getting comfortable with your own mortality. As part of Dying to Know, we have a final checklist on our website. We have a template for an emotional will, a template for letters, so you can write letters to the people. I have something called a departure box. It's just a box of things that I pop in for different people in my life. Like my daughter, if I wasn't here tomorrow, that's a box that is there for things that are meaningful for me to give her. Just little things that have meaning to you. And if it's journaling, if it's, getting onto one of these websites and creating your digital legacy and, recordings that you want told after you're not here to tell them, creating your advanced care plan. Like, it shouldn't be up to paramedics and family and, doctors in an emergency room to fight over whether you should be resuscitated, whether you should have a feeding tube. Yes, they're confronting questions, but not as confronting as being faced in, the worst grief of your life, making these hard decisions. Advanced Care Planning Australia is a beautiful resource. It's National Palliative Care Week this week, which means, looking at what palliative care is, and it's not an ugly word. It's there to support everyone at end of life. It's our human right to have it. You don't need to be actively dying to have it. You know, at first sign of diagnosis, palliative care love to hear from you, to know that you're in their area and that you may be needing support. You can die at home. The government has released funds for that from the 1st of July, $25,000 for people to be supported to die at home. It does take a bit of a village approach to actually have that support in the dying process. But there's so much available out there. We live in a world where we have this computer in our pocket, you know. Go on there and put it in and find out what's available in your area. And if it's not there and you think it should, create it, you know. I spent years supporting the rough sleeping community in Sydney, in the city, in the CBD, out west and on the North Shore and Northern Beaches. And one of the things that the founder of our movement, which was Blanket Patrol and Sydney Street Kitchen, he used to say this regularly. It was his birthday yesterday too, and he used to say, if you think something should be done, no, if you think there should be something done, then remember you are that someone, you know, like just have a go. Like, we don't need a qualification or a piece of paper to be a good human and to offer support and help to people and to lean into what it means to be prepared ourselves.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Danni. You have first of all, for sharing your personal story of grief and death, and for offering so much resourceful thoughts and insights for all of us to take away. So it's been wonderful. I look forward to our next chat.
Yeah, I really appreciate you asking me to come on and talk these good things, and you know, I appreciate your time and your curiosity in this space too. It's really appreciated.
No worries. We'll love your work and have a wonderful week. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Kintsugi Heroes. Thank you to Colin Lilly for permission to use Broken as our theme music for this series. If you enjoyed this conversation, share the podcast with a friend and let us know by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support Kintsugi Heroes and the stories we share, head to kintsugiheroes.com.au and follow the instructions to make a tax-deductible donation. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.